Hi, and welcome to Spoonful of Strength. I'm Rachel, and I live with multiple sclerosis, type 1 diabetes, and a few other diagnoses that keep life interesting.
And I'm Tina. I am a fibromyalgia warrior with chronic back issues and a proud stage 4 cancer survivor. We're sisters, and together we're here to support, inspire, and connect. So if you're new here, the spoon theory explains how we navigate life with limited energy or spoons.
And we're thrilled to share that we've been ranked number 30 on FeedSpot's Top 100 Chronic Illness podcast list. So grab a spoon and let's dig into stories, tips, and a whole lot of strength.
Welcome to the newest episode of Spoonful of Strength. This week we are going to have some special guests, Kerry and Nova, joining us talking about clinical trials. Both of them have amazing backgrounds working in the clinical trial field, so they're going to talk all things clinical trials. But before we get into that, how are you doing this week, Rachel?
I am doing pretty well. I'm excited getting back into the podcast as the people that we've already met have been fantastic, and I think this is going to be a good season. On a personal note, I found out this last week that I have to have surgery on my knee, so that's not going to be fun. But it's been bothering me for 10 months, I think. So it'll be good to get it taken care of. So I know you're enjoying this weekend up at your camper. I'm so jealous because I can see the trees behind you, and I'm just sitting here in my recliner, but. So what are you up to?
Well, enjoying a getaway. This is this is our second season up here, and this is the first time that we actually have some friends from back home coming up for the weekend to join us. So I'm looking forward to entertaining in the new camper this year.
Yeah.
But looking forward to the weekend. As you know, things have been a little hectic on
Hmm.
my end with my mother-in-law being recently diagnosed with Alzheimer's. So a lot of things going on in that situation. But we're doing the best we can and enjoy the downtime when we have it.
Yeah. Seems like, I don't know for you, but it seems like for me, things will be, I don't want to say quiet because I feel like my life is never quiet. But it seems like it goes into these waves of like everything hits all at once and everything just feels like a tornado. And I feel like that's where I've been. And I'm hoping once I get the surgery done, then things will quiet down. But for you, does it seem like it kind of comes in waves where everything
Yeah,
is,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah, absolutely. Especially just, that recently with her diagnosis. We had gotten that phone call about an hour before we lost my little almost 14-year-old doodle Ivy. So that all hit
Mhm.
like all at the same night. Everything just kind of,
Mm,
you know, slammed us. So I agree. I just feel like at times it's like just smooth sailing and it's just
mhm.
like, even if you're busy and lots of things going on, it's still just life as normal. But then all the extra stuff just kind of comes in, and it, it could definitely get you to the point of just feeling like it's a lot and it's too much. So,
Yeah. How are you taking care of your mental health during this?
uh, um, I am trying to force myself now more. I feel like for a few weeks I was really spiraling emotionally. And then I realized I need to settle down, calm myself down. So I'm trying to spend more time out walking and just getting out of the house versus just staying nonstop in the house. Trying to work on every little thing and organizing every little um there's a lot of things that need to be taken care of with my mother-in-law as far as medical and financial and things like that. So I really this past week have forced myself to start taking a break because I was just a ball of anxiety.
Hmm. Yeah, I think most of us with chronic illness or when something else comes up, whether it be with family or financial or anything like that, it's like we already deal with so much. Then when you add in the quote unquote normal frustrations, then
Yeah.
it can be overwhelming. But we're glad
Yeah.
that you're here today and we're excited to talk to our experts. I'm going to call them experts because they know a lot more than I do, but in just a little bit. But we do have some things to talk about. We wanted to start season 4 with talking about the reactions from the previous episode. So we're going to try and keep up with that throughout the season. So our last episode was about toxic positivity. And so I threw out a question to the Instagram page about have you experienced toxic positivity in regards to your chronic illness? So, Tina, do you want to share one?
Multiple sclerosis fighter 31 said, I've had others with chronic illnesses tell me that I'm only allowed to be positive. I can't feel other emotions. And then healthy people tell me all the time that at least I won't die from MS. Like that's helpful to say to me.
Oh, oh, that got
That,
me.
yeah, that's,
I had to
oh, it's just,
stop for that
it's,
one. I was like, oh, and I've had people tell me, well, at least it's not cancer, and it seems like that's kind of similar, but it's like,
yeah.
no, I'm not going to die from this, but I'm going to have to live with this every day for the rest of my life. So sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt that, but that one hit me a little
Oh
bit.
no.
So
I knew that one would hit you hard
yeah,
and that's an awful thing to say. And then chronically
yeah,
elusive said toxic positivity is like an epidemic.
mm, yeah, I think so
I kind of
too.
agree with that. It can be. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's to me everybody just in general, not even just with chronic illness warriors, just in general, the people are that push that think positive vibes only, think positive thoughts only. And in my opinion, I know we've touched on this a few times. It's just it does the other emotions a disservice.
Yeah, yeah, exactly, exactly. Hannah the zebra commented, I've had a couple of family members tell me they believe I'll get better. I've been diagnosed with about a dozen chronic illnesses and conditions in the last year and a half. Some have treatments, some don't, and none have cures. I'm trying to process everything, find effective treatments, and accept the changes that are going on in my body. Sure, I'd love to be completely better. What I need now is for people to acknowledge that this is really hard and that I need a lot of support. Positivity isn't always positive or helpful. I feel for you, Hannah. That sounds like you've had a rough time. I think it's so hard when the people closest to you don't recognize what you're going through. And so, uh, gosh, my heart breaks for her and you know, hopefully she's got a good support either through friends or social media that she can reach out to. So
Yeah.
we appreciate the feedback from our first episode and are looking forward to continuing to bring you some updates from our episode. Well, we're here to talk about clinical trials and was something both of us wanted to talk about, but I think you and I both realized that an episode of you and I talking about clinical trials would probably be, how do I say, probably wouldn't be a very good episode. Do you agree?
Probably not. I think that if the two of us, it wouldn't be as informative as
Yeah,
what's about to uh to happen.
yeah, yeah. I am in a clinical trial and but because of because I have more than one chronic illness and some of them overlap. I was invited to do a clinical trial for an MS app that you would log on to every 3 months, complete some testing, and it would be a way for your doctor to be able to see if the illness is progressing. So there's like an eye test, there's a walking test, there's some other dexterity test and things like that. And so I've been doing that clinical trial for about a year now, but that wasn't enough for me to feel like I was comfortable talking about it. And we've got Kerry and Nova coming on to talk more about medicine clinical trials, and they've got a lot of experience in that. Was there ever a clinical trial for your cancer because it was so rare? Because I feel like clinical trials tend to look toward the more rare conditions. Was there ever anything?
There, there's a doctor at Johns Hopkins that was doing a study, or she's that is her my cancer was is her specific um um focus.
Mm,
And but I don't know if there was an actual clinical trial going on because I didn't see her that I didn't go and consult with her until I had the reoccurrence
mm,
um in 2020. And that was just it was just a single lymph node, but we went to her for a second opinion as far as what she thought would treat it. Um and I know she had said there may have been a trial going on at that point. But I'll be honest, it's not, I just went through at the time when you first get that diagnosis, it's you put your faith in the oncologist, I put my faith in my first oncologist and the urologist and let them work out together and didn't really think about looking into clinical trials because I guess I didn't realize that it was something I could kind of go out and look for on my own.
do you think that you would have, with the statistics that you were given for this type of cancer, do you think that you would have done a clinical trial if it was brought to you?
Um, that's a good question because that's a scary question of
Mm,
um I probably would have.
mm, yeah.
I know that I probably if it were to come back and they said, "Hey, there's a clinical trial going on," I probably would now
Hmm.
because it's obviously the first line of treatment didn't knock it all out. So, but
Yeah. Yeah. I think there's a lot of anxiety and fear going into a clinical trial, especially if you have something where there is no cure, of feeling like, is this my only hope of getting better? Or if it's something that is fatal, of feeling like, this is the only option I've got.
right. Yeah. I think that looking back then, I would have more than likely, even if a clinical trial had been brought to my attention, I more than likely would have tried what the first
Hmm.
option would be, and if I didn't respond to that, then go into the clinical trial.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense.
Let's go ahead and welcome our guests in. So today we're joined by Kerry. She's a clinical development expert with over 25 years of experience in global clinical operations. She's led teams across the US and Europe and played a key role in bringing multiple FDA-approved treatments to the market, especially in the rare and orphan disease space. Kerry's also a fellow Spoonie with psoriatic arthritis and Hashimoto's thyroiditis.
Also joining us today is Nova. She's an RN MBA, a clinical research expert with over 35 years of experience in the pharmaceutical industry. Nova currently consults for early stage biotech companies with a focus on immunotherapy, gene therapy, and rare diseases. She previously served as VP of Clinical Operations at Fortress Biotech and has a diverse background that includes teaching mathematics at Harvard. Nova holds degrees in nursing, mathematics, economics, and business. So we've got some really knowledgeable people to talk to us about this. So I'm so excited. So you want to
Yeah,
go
me
ahead and
too.
bring them in?
Yes, come on in. Welcome, Carrie and Nova.
We are so happy today that we are joined by Kerry and Nova. We want to thank you guys for coming in and talking to us about clinical trials. We've got a lot of questions, a lot of things that we want to talk about. So I'm going to start by asking each of you to introduce yourself. Kerry, we'll go ahead and start with you. Tell us a little bit about yourself and about what you've done with clinical trials.
Sure. My name's Kerry Biron. I've been a clinical development professional for over 25 years, and I've worked in the large pharma to small biotech space throughout my career. My passion is really the rare and orphan disease space, and so that's really where trials are conducted to refine personalized medicine or address unmet medical needs. And so that's really where I thrive. I'm also a chronic illness patient, so I've been diagnosed with psoriatic arthritis, Hashimoto's, and occipital neuralgia. So I am sort of twofold here, and I really appreciate you asking us to join.
Oh, we're so happy that you did. Nova, do you want to introduce yourself as well?
Yeah, thank you so much for having us today on this really important topic of clinical trials. I'm Nova Silver, and I've been, I usually say in and around clinical trials for about 35 years. I got started because my dad was very much interested in research, and I was his first clinical coordinator. I did this work for him back even before I graduated in high school. So I love the clinical trial space. In order to sort of advance my understanding, I went back to school, went to college, but then went back to school for nursing and got my MBA. And in fact, the business of clinical trials really does integrate the science, the operations, and then the business part of it. So my last industry job, I was vice president of clinical operations for a small to mid-sized biotech for which we had multiple subsidiary companies. So I felt like I got to see everything from we call sort of small molecule development to large molecule, like the cell and gene therapy. And over the last decade or decade and a half, like Carrie, I've been very focused on rare orphan disease development, drug development, because frankly, that unmet medical need is such a critical component. Yes, we can do clinical trials in sort of crowded spaces, but from my perspective, it's very interesting to delve into the rare and unmet disease space. So that's where I've been focused for the last decade and a half or so.
Are you living with pain? We get it. And we're done pretending it's just a part of life.
That's why we use the universal heat patch from Spicy. Natural, clean heat, no meds, no mess.
It sticks on discreetly, moves with you, and gives you up to 12 hours of relief. No cords, no chemicals, just actual comfort.
Created by people who live with pain, for people who live with pain. Finally.
Grab yours at getspicy.com. That's GETSPICEY.com. And follow Get Spicy for real talk and real tools.
Spicy, because you deserve relief that works.
And thanks to Spicy for giving our listeners 10% off when you use the code Spoonful. That's Spoonful with 2 L's at getspicy.com.
I'm sure, like many of us, we've heard of clinical trials. You see advertisements and such, but can you break down really what is a clinical trial? How, like the different phases and such?
Sure. And it's a good question because certainly people see those advertisements and, you hear it, but you don't really understand. And really the goal of clinical research is generally to develop knowledge that improves human health or increases our understanding of human biology, as a sort of broad answer to that. But we have to remember that people who participate in clinical research make it possible for us to obtain that knowledge. And so to determine if a new drug is safe or effective, once they do preclinical testing in the laboratory, we have to test on patient volunteers. And so in order to do that, we have four phases we called phases of clinical trials, and those phases are necessary so that we can systematically evaluate the safety and effectiveness of a new treatment. We want to ensure that they're safe for human use before there's any widespread availability on the commercial market. And so to sort of quickly break that down, if you start with a phase one, which would be a first in human, we have this new drug and we want to test in human, that's going to be the purpose of that is to look at safety and dosage of a new treatment in a very tiny group of people, so 20 to 50 to 100 patients. And that's sometimes in healthy volunteers or sometimes the condition that you're studying. And the goal is really to determine the best way to administer the treatment, identify your side effects, and find appropriate dosage. So is it a weekly dose? Is it a monthly dose? How are we administering? Once you have that information, you are going to either scrap it because you have side effects that are not going to allow you to proceed. But if you can proceed, you're going to move to phase two. And that purpose is to now assess the effectiveness of the product. So we looked at safety and dosage before. Now we want to look, does it work? And so we're looking at the effectiveness of the treatment, and we want to continue to evaluate safety in a little bit of a larger group. And in this group, it's going to be the patients that have the condition that's being studied. And so we're going to refine dosage and administration there. Phase three, now we're confirming. We take everything we've learned in phase one, phase two, and we now want to confirm the effectiveness, the safety in a larger and more diverse group. So now you're looking at several hundred to several thousand patients with the condition being studied. And the goal there is to really compare this with existing treatments or maybe a placebo, depending, or if there isn't a treatment, a standard available, how does it fit into the line of therapy? Also monitor side effects, collect information, then to support a regulatory or marketing approval. So at that point, you collate all of the information you have, you provide that to the FDA, in our case, in the US, and hope for you have enough data to support approval of that product to be commercially available, to be sold in the commercial market. And then finally, phase four is once you have approval, you want to continue to monitor side effects once it's available to the public. And so a phase four study would do that, would monitor in the real world setting, gather information about long-term safety and effectiveness and potential side effects that haven't yet been identified. And the final piece to that would be if you're looking at an indication that is not yet approved with the same product. So we were looking at taking this product and maybe using it for a different indication. That would also work into a phase four. So those are the four phases. And as you can see, they've kind of systematically build on each other to give us a really robust way to manage research to get to a place where we can get agency approval to make it available to patients.
Right. And to feel fully comfortable that the safety package, along with the risk benefit that we're determining in the efficacy or proof of concept stage, is really well understood. One other thing, since we mentioned in sort of the intros our mutual interest in rare disease, is that oftentimes this phase 1 through 4 doesn't exactly happen in that way. What Kerry described really well was articulating the generic or the general path forward for drugs and approvals. But if you're a patient in a trial and you're being invited into a phase 1 or a phase 2 or a phase 3, it's not always abundantly clear where you are in the development path, which is sort of an interesting conundrum for the patient. It's important to ask, if you're a clinical trial patient, how much has been studied. It's generally, articulated in an informed consent, but as a consumer of clinical trials, you have to really be educating yourself on what comes before, even though there is this staged approach and it's done extremely methodically to understand. But as Kerry presented, not all trials are conducive to really early healthy volunteer trials. Some drugs that we take into a patient aren't suitable to put into a healthy volunteer. So effectively, the phase 1 aspect of sort of the checking in the healthy volunteer trial is we skip over it. We go right into patient trials.
Mhm. Okay. I kind of have a two-part question. With people with chronic illnesses that may have more than one diagnosis, if you have a medicine for multiple sclerosis, but I also have type 1 diabetes and maybe asthma or respiratory issues, is it harder to get into a trial when you have more of a complex diagnosis? And then my second part of that question is that a lot of people with chronic illness can feel like, especially if their illness is progressing, they can feel like they're losing hope. And this might be something that they're kind of, they feel like clinical trials might be a last ditch effort, and kind of how that works for the chronic illness community.
Yeah, I'm probably tackle some of that, and Carrie, maybe you can add on. So the first part of your question, which is, what we consider sort of comorbid or coexisting conditions, that is such an important question because, and actually the particular illnesses that you described, often there are treatments that sort of cover those indications on the whole. If you like, for instance, consider autoimmune disease, there are drugs that are being tested for autoimmune disease. And so very often in clinical trials, what we're looking for is the bespoke individual that has the one, but maybe not the whole of all of those conditions, because we really want to isolate and understand how the drug is working for that particular indication. You see this in cancers as well. So, for instance, you'll see cancer trials that are designed to treat a cancer, but if you have a coexisting alternative cancer, you may be excluded from the trial, even though the particular drug that we're testing may actually help a panoply of things. It's the isolation of the indication that gives us the clearest signal. So we talk a lot about patient heterogeneity, which is just a fancy way of saying that people are diverse in their presentation. They present with multiple indications, they present with multiple complications, and that sometimes the outcomes of those other indications can confound results. So the purpose, particularly in early phase, like phase 2, the purpose is really to refine our understanding for what we call proof of concept for the drug. We want to understand, does this drug work in this patient particularly? And so in phase 2 or earlier phases, you might see more of this honing in on or excluding patients with confounding illnesses. Phase 3, when it opens up into phase 3, sometimes we take a broader patient population. They can have other indications, they can have other things, because phase 3 is bridging to what we call real life experience when it's out in the market. So we might sort of flex out the eligibility criteria, allow patients to come in that have multiple indications, even though we're not specifically trying to treat those. And as an adjunct to that, oftentimes you find other indications for treatment just by virtue of the fact that you have a more diverse population. And what I mean by that is that sometimes, so all drugs have side effects. That's just, if they don't, they're probably not doing anything. But those side effects can turn into treatments. If you notice, for instance, just as an example, a drug is lowering blood pressure, well, maybe it's not being treated for hypertension, but later, if you see in a population that the blood pressure was lowered, you might consider that as a future indication to study. Do we want to study this as an antihypertensive, for instance? I didn't touch on your second question, but I'll pause and see if Carrie, if you had anything to add on to that in terms of how we take patients in that have multiple conditions, let's say.
The only thing I would add to that is that it's not there are occasions where um, sort of additional conditions are considered. And so in our eligibility criteria where we say you have to have X condition, this is the condition we're studying, we have inclusion. So this is what we want you to have, and exclusion. This is what you cannot have. Otherwise, you're not eligible for this study. And we could say, if you have type 2 diabetes that's well controlled and it scientifically is not going to impact the results of the condition being studied, that will be prescribed in the eligibility criteria. And so we do see, liver, sometimes kidney, sometimes it's HIV or diabetes. And if these things are well controlled, it's not an issue for inclusion. So I would say for folks evaluating a clinical trial, don't discount something just because you have other conditions and this is what they're studying. Psoriatic arthritis, that's what they're studying, but I have multiple other conditions. Because once the eligibility is read, you might find your other conditions don't really matter. So it's a double, sort of edged sword, and it just depends on what you have.
Yeah.
Coming to your second part of that question, which is the people with chronicity and, our clinical trial sort of viewed from the perspective of, let's say, this is a last ditch effort or this is my last hope. I think that's how you put it, Rachel. It's such an important consideration for people coming into clinical trials, because there are certainly, I can recount even personal examples of people and friends that I know where a clinical trial is truly we sometimes call it salvage therapy. We sometimes call it a last line of therapy, or it's a last hope. On the other hand, I think sometimes because of the way certain trials are designed to be, you failed this treatment, you failed this treatment, you failed this treatment. So the criteria for eligibility is refined to exclude anybody who's had help with other treatments. And that's done for that express purpose that we were talking about with the risk and the benefit. The purpose of excluding people who have benefited from first or second or tertiary treatment is because we're really, in effect, in that clinical trial setting, offering to somebody a last line therapy. But that's not always the case, and particularly in chronic disease. Clinical trials, I think, can be used as a means of advancing research, advancing your own personal health. I speak also to personal experience with this, where there are chronic diseases in which people come in and out of clinical trials while they're following standard of care. And they don't lose their standard of care, but these become augments or adjuvants or additional, or they might be controlling a component of the disease. And there are several examples of clinical trials where you're not required to come off of your standard of care in order to participate. So even in a case where you've got somebody with a chronic disease, they're not getting adequate help from their treatment. There are treatment protocols that are designed as strictly adjuvant, and they're not. I would never want anybody to kind of look at it as a last resort, but there are certainly examples in which that's exactly the reality, unfortunately.
Yeah.
Yeah. Do the participants actually, are they given the results or the outcome of the trials, or at least the phases that they were part of?
So there, I would say most investigators do a really good job of monitoring patients' welfare during the course of the trial. May not be as good about distributing results. That being said, I would say if they do not, then ask. Results have to be published. We have a website, clinicaltrials.gov, I'm sure many people are familiar with, where the results of a clinical trial must be published. Now, it could be a year and a half after the end of the trial, but they are published. Now, that's the final results of the study. But during the course of the patient's progression throughout the clinical trial, the physician certainly will be having discussions with them about their course and how they're doing. They may not necessarily be talking about the entirety of the study and the results of the, the goal of the program is, but their participation as an individual, certainly they'll be getting results throughout the course of the trial. So for the entire study, it would likely be that they would wait until the very end and see the study published. Did that
Yeah.
answer your question, Tina?
Yes, absolutely. It sure did. Thank you.
Yeah. And just one more point that although we're required by law to publish the results, I mean, truly, I think in some instances, unless you're very accustomed to reading scientific literature, I would say a lot of that can be even unintelligible or uninterpretable. And if you participated in a clinical trial and let's say you had to withdraw early from that trial, or even you completed the trial, but the trial is ongoing at the time of the completion of your participation. I mean, to Kerry's point, it would be really useful for a participant to go back and ask the investigator, the person who's responsible at the clinical trial site, the one who recruited you to the trial, about the trial results, because I don't think that we have a very good mechanism right now for automatically reporting that back to patients. You would, as an individual, have to be proactive, either going and looking at the journals, looking at clinicaltrials.gov, understanding those data. And again, unless you are actively a part of or seeing the investigator on a regular basis, I don't think and even in most clinical centers, they don't have necessarily established procedures. It's not universal, but there's not an established procedure to go back and then say, well, here's how the trial results came out, or here's what you took, meaning, in a placebo-controlled trial where you don't even know if you got the drug or not. There isn't always an avenue or an opportunity to have that conversation back after the trial's been unblinded and we know which participants got drug and which ones got placebo. We put elements in a consent form that discusses things like this, but again, unless you know what you're looking for, you may not even know that you need to ask.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and to kind of tag on to Tina's question, I think one of the things that people could be concerned about entering into a clinical trial is the long-term effects, either side effects or effects of the drug. I'm sure there's absolutely no way to be able to say, well, this is your long-term forecast. That's why you're doing the clinical trial. So how do you deal with that question that I'm sure comes up quite a bit?
Right.
That's a really good one. Yeah.
I think we'll both probably have to jump in here, but
Yeah.
the goal of a trial in most cases is to determine safety and efficacy of a product, right? Long-term risks are typically unknown, and our obligation as the researchers are to tell patients what we know. However, long-term effects may not show up until years down the road. One of the things we do have, though, is, many times is a class effect. So if it's a class of drugs, you might see that in that class of drugs, these are the typical long-term effects. And we expect with this current treatment that we would likely see similar effect. That's what we would know, and that's what we would communicate to the patient during the informed consent process. Nova, I'm sure you can add on to that, but really that's, you're right. Long-term effects you learn over time because we don't know many times.
So you brought up a really good point there, Kerry, about we don't know what we don't know. There are design elements, regulatory considerations, ways in which we sort of approach this in the systematic phase 1 through 4 to kind of garner that information. There's also, we didn't mention this when we covered the study phases, there are what we call special populations. So people who might be affected in a particular way that we study in phase 1 or along the path. And those are people who have They're special populations, so they could be pediatric patients, they could be elderly, they could have hepatic impairment, they could have other things that could confound the clinical pharmacology, which is just how the drug behaves in the body. They could illustrate other paradigms for how we need to consider dosing. You'll see this sometimes in the package insert of the label of the product that talks about how a drug performed in a particular special population. So we have those benefits. Kerry mentioned the class effects. When you start to move into large molecules like cell and gene therapy, there are mandates in which you have to follow people for anywhere from 5 to 15 years, depending on the type of biologic and the regulatory environment, if you're in the US or not. So there's sort of mandates, and then there's also these very, I would say, very like they're precision in terms of the science, but they're perfunctory things that you want to watch for after so many half-lives of the drug. And half-life is the time at which it takes for half of the drug to leave the body metabolically. So we have to follow for so many half-lives after the drug is administered to see whether or not there's an effect, a safety effect. That said, there are plenty of cases in which the denominator, so the numbers of people in your trial that you're testing, is insufficient to detect an extraordinarily rare event. And sometimes, and that comes out in long-term surveillance, in some ways, a clinical trial is a precursor to a marketed product, but if you think about it, it's on a continuum. As long as the drug is out in the market, it's being tested, or even drugs in the class that are being tested, you're effectively doing in conducting clinical trials. It's in a different environment. It's not a controlled space for requiring certain provisions, but you're still assessing adverse events and long-term events and trying to pick up, and the FDA has surveillance and the European authorities have surveillance for this, where you're reporting these very rare events, and there are examples of drugs being recalled from the market for that very reason. So Kerry's right. We say what we know. We do it systematically. We do it slowly. We try to include sufficient denominators to capture what we would consider to be even rare events, but the ultra rare events, sometimes you don't know that, and that can come out when you have, instead of thousands of people, tens or hundreds or millions of people taking a drug, something that's very rare.
Mm-hmm. Join Spoonful of Strength on Instagram, a community open to everyone. Whether you have a chronic illness or support someone who does, you are welcome at Spoonful of Strength. You'll get preview clips of the upcoming episodes and insight into my world as a Spoonie. That's Spoonful of Strength, Spoonful with 2 L's, on Instagram.
So what safeguards do they put in place for those going through clinical trials in the case of severe side effects?
So I can sort of start this. We have, multiple safeguards. It's our responsibility to safeguard the well-being of our patients. Now, starting out, if you don't know the side effects, you know what you expect, even if it's a later phase study, you would outline those in your informed consent. But additionally, we are going to have guidance for the clinical trial site. So if this particular side effect happens, this is what you're going to do. And if it's an emergency type side effect, this is what you need to do. And we do see that a lot in oncology or in cell therapy, where you could have a significant side effect. We expect that you might. They would put either prophylaxis in place, where they pre-treat the patient with something that could potentially alleviate that side effect, or emergency procedures, or you have specialists standing by when the patient is treated. But additionally, for first-in-human studies, you wouldn't know. So those patients are typically treated in the hospital, or there's some sort of telemetry available We have our standardized protocols where you would, in cell therapy, for example, you might have a dose escalation. So you're going to start to see some sort of side effect maybe as you go, and it might get worse as you escalate. And that gives you the opportunity to de-escalate. And maybe then you know that that's going to be your max dose. And then you have, for later trials, you would have patient training, you would have emergency cards for first responders for particular severe effects. Nova, I'm sure that's not at all.
You covered a lot there, Carrie, and it's really great. I think I mean the only thing that I can say is that you can only know what you can know and anticipate. But even in that we don't know what every side effect, we sort of know um, going into it just by virtue of knowing the biology of a human, the kinds of things that can go wrong. You can affect the heart rhythm. You can affect the kidneys. You know basically how a drug is metabolized, sometimes even before you go into a human being, because we have what's called in vitro testing, which is testing that's done in a laboratory in a test tube, or we have models, animal models that are used to replicate the disease, and so we can understand. And there's the fancy word is toxicology, but we use toxicology to inform. If you see something in an animal, it doesn't necessarily mean it's going to show up in the human animal, but certainly it gives you some safeguards in order to know what to look for. And one of the things that regulators require is that we have covered um, the the dose and then some by an order of magnitude in many cases, the dose that we would ever start in a human being. And one of the reasons why you start in, let's say, a healthy volunteer population is because, in fact, um, if you're going to see something, you might naturally see it in a healthy volunteer because they don't have all of these confounding, they're not waking up with the aches and pains. They're not having these. So anything like a headache, a stomach ache, these aren't things that that person is typically experiencing on the day to day. So we note and mark every single one of those, and we count every single one of those events, and then we build the safety database across sometimes multiple indications in order to formulate what's the collection of expected side effects. But I think, Tina, you were sort of asking also about like maybe the unexpected things. So our job in clinical trial design and execution is to anticipate the unanticipated, whether it be from a class effect or just what we know about biology, or what was seen or perhaps not seen in animal trials, and put in several safety and measures and safeguards. So general physical exams, routine labs, sometimes an EKG, sometimes more specific diagnostic equipment in order to survey and do early surveillance. Carrie mentioned telemetry. We often put people into a clinical trial setting that almost mimics a hospital right at the get-go when we first introduce the drug. So there's a crash cart there, there's an emergency physician, there's a hospital there. It's rare, but it does happen where you do see things like that, and you can immediately address them. You gain more confidence as you go on in the clinical trials because, like I said, your denominator increases in your patient population, so that hopefully by phase 3, you've really sort of seen the bulk of what you expect to see, and then you just validate those numbers. You validate that it wasn't higher or lower than you expected. But even in spite of all of these safeguards, there are additional measures that we have to put in place, independent safety review boards. We have a medical monitor that sits on top of the the principal investigator, who is surveying from not just the patient perspective or the site perspective, but the study perspective, or even globally across multiple sites. We look at things in trends in safety through many, many lenses, and it's not generally one person doing that, but there are layers of people, and including independent people having nothing to do with the trial itself, that are looking at this in sometimes a blinded fashion, so that they're not confounding themselves. They can see whether there are trends, and sometimes independent safety review boards are even allowed, we give them permission or we give them access to unblinded data, meaning that they know who's on drug and who's on placebo, so that they can actually do statistical assessments, but not conflate that with the clinical team that has to stay blinded so that we're not biased. So
Mhm.
multiple layers, multiple ways, and even in spite of sometimes all of those best efforts, you still have an emergency, and that's why, like Kerry said, we keep emergency cards. They have to inform the ER. We give them mechanisms for de-escalation and sometimes also countermeasures for overdose.
How do you respond to people that worry that clinical trials are more about getting treatments to the market quickly than truly helping patients? What's your take on that? And how long does it actually take on average for a treatment to go through all the trial phases and to be considered ready for the market?
Yeah. So that's another really important, you could say, well, business plays a role. There's no question. We want to, we're in the market of getting drugs on the market, right?
Hmm.
That's our business. But to do it safely and to do it ethically, I've not encountered a group in which I've collaborated in which that is not the primary concern. I won't say that it's not a concern. You want to be able to get to market, and the time that it takes is so variable,
Hmm.
because oftentimes it's indication specific. For instance, if you have an ultra rare disease, you're not going to enroll 1,000 patients in a clinical trial because sometimes they don't exist. You know, in and so the risk benefit profile in ultra rare disease is confounded by the fact that there aren't a lot of patients with the disease. The other confounding factor is, are you entering a crowded space? So for instance, if there are already multiple modalities that are available for patients, you may need to test in more patients in order to really demonstrate that you're either not inferior to existing products or that you have superiority. Um, and you're also sometimes, just by virtue of the fact that, like Carrie mentioned, a class effect, if there's a lot of drugs on the market, oftentimes in clinical trials, we have to slow ourselves down to make sure that we're addressing any class effects. I don't know that there's an average. It would be an interesting statistic. I've never looked into that. How long does it actually take? I know many, many products that were halted early in development because what happened in animals was not analogous to what happened in humans. And we either didn't see the proof of concept that we needed to see, or we didn't have the right outcomes measures, meaning that we didn't understand using that particular endpoint, that there was any, that the benefit didn't outweigh the risk. I don't know. I don't even know if you know, Carrie, if there's an average there. I don't know of any metrics around.
What I would, I mean, what I would say, and I guess this is my own personal opinion, but from my experience, I would say that it it takes years.
Hmm.
It takes years. So whether that's 10 plus years, if you're doing a larger population with a global phase 3 trial, or a small indication or rare disease where you're just doing a phase 1, phase 2, and then
Hmm.
you're going to, to the agency, it still takes years to get there. It might be 5 years for a smaller indication versus 10 plus years, but that also equates to, and if you think about this with the smaller sort of startup companies that are really trying desperately to meet an unmet need, it takes years and it also takes an incredible amount of money to do
Hmm.
this for a business that doesn't have any revenue, right?
Hmm.
So the only revenue is investors. And so it's a balance and it's a challenge. But at the end of the day, everyone is really working towards the same goal of getting whatever product this is to market to meet a patient need.
Hmm.
For those that might be interested in looking for clinical trials, what's the best way? Is it through the website that you looked? Is it through their doctor? Is it a combination of both?
It is. So clinicaltrials.gov is sort of the space to be able to look for any clinical trial out there in the US. Um, there is a way to filter, so you can put, your state, or you could put keywords like your condition, and it will help to filter the trials. Once you've identified maybe some that you think might be appropriate, you can then take that to your physician and say, look, I found these. I don't really, understand, but can you explain? Additionally, many times clinical trial sites are identified and they have open clinical trials. And if you absolutely ask if there's one at your center, or if your site participates as a referral site. So sometimes there's one open trial site in, say, Massachusetts, and you live in Southern Mass, but the trial site is in Boston. Your physician could refer you to the Boston site so that you could participate in the clinical trial. And, more and more as time goes on, where there are more remote type assessments that can be done. So it may not be a visit to that site every time. So I do think it's a matter of both, speaking to your healthcare providers and also looking at the websites. Advocacy groups also are a great place to go. If you have a particular condition that has a great advocacy group, they oftentimes partner with companies to get the word out there. So that's another place to go to look for open clinical trials.
I just want to be really clear. The website is clinical trials, it's plural, clinicaltrials.gov. So if anybody is listening and wants to look that up, I also, even having been in industry and working and using that forum for decades, I still find it complicated. And so I think if
It
you go
is.
out there and you try to, do all of the things and put in the search words and try to refine, you could still end up with hundreds or more of clinical trials, and it's extremely hard to know exactly how to filter down. One word of advice is that if you download hundreds and hundreds of clinical trials and you're trying to figure out what works best for you, some of the easiest ones that you can sort of filter out there are ones that aren't really recruiting patients. And you can tell because they talk about the phases of the trial. So if you're interested in participating as a clinical trial participant, most of the time, if you filter out phase one, you'll come up with a healthy list. That's not a hard and fast rule, though. People put in for phase one when they really are talking about patient trials, but it's just one other way, one other trick in order to filter it down. I think personally, my bias is start by calling large centers that treat and asking for their clinical trial center, and they may be able to also refer, because for us in research, we tend to go to some of the same big hospitals over and over and over again. If it's an established disease, or even if it's not, if you know where there's sort of a center of excellence, you can go, and they often have clinical trial support staff there, and you could also ask them if they have any opening for any of their trials.
I think my last question would be just any overall advice for somebody with a chronic illness who might want to get into a clinical trial. Any last advice that you would have for our listeners?
I think I would just say be open with the communication with your providers. If it's an autoimmune disease, talk to your rheumatologist. Learn what trials are out there for your condition. Maybe your condition isn't as yet bad enough for a particular trial, or maybe you have some confounding things. But if you have that open communication and you have already voiced that you're interested, this is a route that you would like to consider, speaking about it, doing some research on your own, and bringing that to your healthcare provider, I think is incredibly important. I think people think about it but don't voice it enough to want to be a participant or learn about it. And by communicating that to your healthcare providers, you at least have a place to start. Nova?
Yeah, and there's sufficient misinformation on the internet that it can really confound. I would say absolutely starting with a trusted source for information is really critical. The other is, and I say this to people and patients all the time, the longer that you're living with this disease, the better their chances are for there being future treatments and treatment modalities. It's incredibly disheartening to live with a chronic disease or a fatal disease, and it's so easy to sort of give in and give up. Absolutely keeping that line of communication with your physician, with trusted sources, and with advocacy. They often have, Kerry mentioned it, they're often the harbingers of the best information because they're extremely motivated to expand awareness for that particular group. But I agree, keeping an open mind about clinical trials. Clinical trials are not simply, big pharma trying to make money off of a guinea pig. That's not the way that we view it. It's the way that it's benefiting, yes, a community, and it's benefiting research and hopefully the disease and the indication. But even I've heard from people who participate in which they've gotten no clinical benefit. There's sort of a satisfaction of having tried something to benefit and to help their individual situation. And sometimes just having somebody to talk to, even if you don't get clinical benefit, there's sort of this ancillary benefit. And I sound like I'm making the case for clinical trials. Stay informed. I don't mean to be, but it's certainly an excellent avenue, and it's not just for the people without options. It's sometimes just there as an adjuvant.
Mm-hmm. Great.
This has just been so amazingly informative, and
Yeah.
I was just sitting here thinking about how much how glad I am that you all joined us today to talk about clinical trials.
Yeah. Yeah.
We are
This
thrilled to be here.
discussion
Thank
has
you.
been so much more than we hoped for, and a lot of great information. And
Yeah.
I appreciate so much that both of you took time out to talk with us and help our listeners understand a little bit more about clinical trials. So thank you so much.
Yeah,
You're
thank
very
you for
welcome.
having us, and thank you for what you do.
Oh,
Exactly. Yes,
Oh.
absolutely. Thank you both.
That's so kind. Thank
Yes.
you.
I am so glad that we had them join us. This was amazingly informative as far as clinical trials.
Yeah, there was a lot of information that I didn't realize. I have never been approached for a clinical trial for a medicine or anything like that. And so I didn't really have a lot of knowledge about that. But the amount of time it takes to go through the different levels of the trial, and there was just so much information I wasn't aware of. So I'm so glad that we didn't try to do this by ourselves.
Right. Yes, definitely. We our listeners received so much better information than if it
Yeah.
had just been the two of us.
Yeah. Welcome to Spoonful, where we don't know anything about this topic. So we're going to bring in the people that will. So
we're gonna find the people that do.
yeah, exactly. So I don't think we could have picked any other two people that would have brought such great information. So Kerry and Nova were just amazing in everything. So this was probably one of my favorite episodes, just because I felt like this is really some good information that we can bring to our listeners. So I'm so happy that we did this episode. We're so excited to bring you more episodes this season, bringing you some different topics we haven't spoken about and some more special Spoonie guests. So in this next week, take care of yourself and don't forget to save some spoons. Take care. Thanks for tuning in to this episode of Spoonful of Strength. We hope that you found a little inspiration and maybe even a new perspective to carry with you.
If you enjoyed today's episode, don't forget to hit that like button, follow us for more, and leave a comment. We'd love to hear your thoughts.
And if you're feeling generous, please take a moment to rate and review the podcast. Your support helps us reach more Spoonies just like you.
Until next time, remember to take care of yourself and keep finding strength in your story. Bye for now.
And see you next time on Spoonful of Strength.